Hello everyone, should we start? Today the lecture is going to be held in English language, so I suppose that most of us understand English. So before starting the introduction, I would like to, first and foremost, I would like to thank Professor Ioannidis for kindly accepting our invitation to present his book at the Oxford University Greek Society. In addition, I would like to thank Oxford University as a university that supports us and gives all these facilities. Professor Andrea Cipriani and the Network Meta-Analysis course that accommodated and hosted Professor Ioannidis, so we had the opportunity to have him here for the society. And it's, I would like to say that it's quite difficult task to present Professor Ioannidis' life accomplishments in just a 5-minute introduction talk. I could go for an hour and talk, so if I go over his CV, it could take more than an hour talk, but I'll try to restrict it and summarize it in 10 minutes. So, Professor Ioannidis is the chair of the CF Renborn Disease Prevention Center, which is based in Stanford University. He's a professor of medicine, health research and policy, biomedical data sciences, and statistics. He's also the co-director at the Meta Research Innovation Center at Stanford, a director of the PhD program in epidemiology, and the clinical research center there. And there are a lot of research centers that collaborate, and the list goes on and on and on and on. He was born in New York in New York City in 1967, and he was raised in Athens. He was the valedictorian at the Athens College, and he received the National Award from the Greek Mathematical Society in 1984. Then he got a degree from the medical school and Doctor of Science from the Biopathology department at the National University of Athens, and then he traveled across the borders and across the Atlantic, and he trained in Harvard and Tufts University. He held different positions, numerous positions like the NIH, so the National Institute of Health, the Imperial College and Tufts University. He chaired the Department of Hygiene, so he turned back to Greece, and he chaired the Department of Hygiene and Epidemiology at the University of Ioannina at the medical school, where he was there. It was from 1999 till 2010, if I'm correct, right? Yeah. He's an adjunct faculty for the Tufts University since 1996. And he's at the professorship rank since 2002. He's an author of more than 900 papers in peer-reviewed journals and a highly cited researcher according to Thomson Reuters in both clinical and social sciences discipline. His age index is around 156. He has been cited by 150,000 scientists and Google Scholar. Based on his report, he doesn't consider that citation metrics are correct because he thinks that they are highly unreliable. Because based on his reports, he has been rejected over than 1,000 times over his life. He considers himself a lifelong learner and privileged to work with younger students, young scientists from across the globe. According to The Atlantic, he might be one of the most influential scientists alive and a brave thinker scientist. In the past, he has received many awards, honorary titles, honorary doctorates, multiple honorary lectureships across the globe. His most famous paper is one at the PLOS Medicine, which was named Why Most of Published Research Findings Are False, and this paper has been clicked over than 2 million times and have been read. So this is the scientific part of Professor Ioannidis. Now we're going to say a short review of his writer part. So today we are presenting his book Tractatus on the sixth fame. Tractatus yet necti fini. He's an author of 6 literary books in Greek, 2 of which have been published, and this is the 3rd one. So it's the Toccata for the Girl with a Burnt Face by Kairos Publishing in 2012, and the Variations on the Art of the Fugue and Desperate Ricercar by Kairos also. And both of these 2 books were shortlisted for Best Book of the Year by Anagnostis Awards back in Greece. The book Tractatus on the 6th theme, or the Ecti Fini, consists basically of 240 chapters, and based on my estimations, I think that it's inspired by the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus of the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, the title at least. Inside the book, we basically see 2 different types of novel writing. The absurd, or in Greek the paralogy, the necrologies of scientists, the abduction myth of Persephone, and constructions, karasketas. I think that I have said enough, so it's time to proceed to our speaker.
Thank you, Nikitas. Thank you for the very kind invitation and for the great introduction. Since I don't think that the audience is vast, and I would like to know a little bit about where you come from. Why don't we start with a very brief introduction, like your name and your discipline, just to get a sense of what disciplines are represented in the room. No need for a full CV, but and we can start from the back coming forward. So
I'm George. I'm a computer scientist. I'm a postdoc here.
Okay.
My name is Christos. I'm from computer science. I'm a PhD student in Hong Kong.
Hong Kong. Wow. Okay.
My name is Christodina and I'm an architect.
My name is Manasa and I'm a postdoc here at biochemistry.
Leonidas, I'm a psychiatry trainee doctor. I actually had the honor to be one of your medical students in 2002 in Ioannidis.
I'm Kira, I'm a PhD student in clinical medicine.
I'm Rossini and I'm a data scientist and I work in a company here.
I'm Thanasis, PhD student in public health and nutrition.
I'm Chrysanthi, I'm a social scientist at the Department of Primary Care.
I'm Jans, I'm a postdoctoral student in computer science.
I'm Alan. I originally did theoretical physics and now I'm doing finance and programming.
I'm Aphrodite, a project manager.
I'm Georgia Salanti, biostatistics.
I'm Orestes. I also did some theoretical physics and I also do biostatistics.
I'm Andrea Cipriani. I'm a psychiatrist and a professor.
And a great composer, and also player organ.
I'm Nikitas. I'm a psychiatrist and a researcher here.
Who's my turn? I'm Nick. I'm a PhD student in engineering.
I'm Diana Irena. I'm also doing medical statistics and biostatistics, not biostatistics. There you go.
I'm Vangelis. I'm a medical doctor and currently a PhD student in cardiovascular medicine.
Hi, I'm Sophie, I'm a medical doctor, a junior doctor here. Yeah. Hi, I'm Maria, I'm one of the college pharmacists in Church. Hi, I'm Fatina, I'm a neonatal nurse in Jaya Hospital.
Hi, I'm Chris, I'm a gastroenterologist.
I'm Elena, medical statistician.
Hi, I'm Clary. I study linguistics and I work at Oxford University Press.
Hello, I'm Aphrodite, I'm a pharmacist.
And discipline, you get infectious diseases.
I am Alex. I'm one of the named veterinary surgeons of the Royal Veterinary College.
I'm Marios. I'm a PhD student in material science.
You're Marios.
Well,
you're a postdoc.
Yeah, no.
You need to to adjust to.
I'm Alexander, so I'm a medical student here in Moscow.
Vasilis Psapatos, with some correspondence. I'm also had rejections more than you ever had in your life, more rejections than you. And I know next to nothing also. One of my fields perhaps is archaeology.
I'm Leo, and I'm at school currently.
Wonderful. So we have polyphony of disciplines, and this is exactly what I enjoy, both in science and in writing, or actually, I should say, in trying to do science and in trying to write. I like polyphony. I like to see if I can put into writing lots of different voices, lots of different perspectives, lots of different viewpoints, and try to come up with some synthesis of some sort. Now, some literary critics who say that they love the book, like the Tractatus, but also my previous books, the first thing that they say is that they're not classifiable. What is that? That's the first question. What sort of book? It's is it prose? Is it novel? There's some poetry, but there's also statistical data. There's scientific data. There's simulations. There's clouds. There's Google searches. There's a little bit of everything sometimes. And I would feel bad if I could write a book that could be just classified in a shelf. This is like a novel, and this is period. I like this polyphony because our society has polyphony, science has polyphony, thinking has polyphony. Even within our own selves, we have different ideas and different perspectives sometimes before we arrive and we settle on something. If you have a Greek background, I don't need to convince you that there's both polyphony and cacophony, and there's lots of voices being heard. There's polemos, war, between all of these voices trying to reach some sort of equilibrium. So, Tractatus on the sixth fame, or for the sixth fame, Tractatus για την έκτη φήμη. Nikitas mentioned the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and many people think of Tractatus immediately, Wittgenstein, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. That's one way to start making a link with what this might be about, what is easily recognizable. If you hear of Tractatus, you probably don't think of some Jesuit of the 17th century in Wittenberg writing some Tractatus Theologia or whatever. You think of Wittgenstein maybe. How could that link to Wittgenstein, if it does link to Wittgenstein? How many people have read the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus?
Or tried to.
Or tried to, yes, because probably no one has really succeeded. Maybe not even Wittgenstein, to be honest. But okay, so a few. Any thoughts on how it might compare? A title on Tractatus on the sixth fame versus a Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. If you think about what is the core message, like what does the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus end up with? What is the final admonition? Do you recall that?
I remember it's a set of statements. It's not easy reading. I mean, it's, and I think that I can't remember exactly because it was the last century when I read it. I remember it was basically you can't say anything about, you can judge what you don't know, so the limit of knowledge, this was, and the power of word or what we have.
So it ends up with an admonition of silence, that there are things that the best thing that we can do about is just be silent, because they transcend our ability to talk about them, to dissect them, to learn about them, to study them scientifically or in any other way. So they say, if you can't do that, just be silent. Don't embarrass yourself by talking and writing. So one way to look at the Tractatus, which looks like a brick, you can throw that as a weapon to your enemy, and a concussion is the minimum damage that they will get, is that it's not silence that it is aiming for. There's lots of dense writing of hundreds and hundreds of pages, and the writer doesn't want to be silent. He wants to talk and describe and attempt to say something about something that is important, which could be science, could be life, could be fame. So fame and fimi are very close, even in the sound that they get. But for the majority of the audience, when they hear the word fame or fimi, what is it that comes to mind? What do you think of fimi? Because there's many different types of fimi or females.
I personally thought it meant rumor.
Okay, so one is rumor, yes, but any other explanations or elaborations?
It comes from the word fimi, which means say.
Okay.
Yeah, so anything to do with words.
Anything to do with words, right? So it could be at the center of expression, in a sense. Actually, one of the most famous singers in Homer was Phemios.
Yes.
So, you know, the archetypal poet is Phemios, you know, talking and trying to make sense out of things that he says, but also rumor. And rumor has connotations of things that we don't really know if they're true. You know, much like in science, we have more certainty about some things, but others are more rumors that are not validated, not justified, and as I have written repeatedly, they are just false positives. Nowadays they're fake news, or alternative facts, or things that don't exist. But nevertheless, they're being told, they're being circulated, they're being advertised, sometimes very widely, sometimes more prominently than reality. Sometimes fimi is more powerful than reality, for good or bad. And if you think about why you do things and why you get motivated, if you think that we are rational beings, I'm a scientist, but I recognize that very often I'm not a rational being. I just hit my head on the wall. If I believe that that's the right thing to do, and I hit it again and again and again, I get rejected 1,000 times and 1,001 if I feel that this is where I should be driven to. For good or bad. Other types of females or fimi, what other things come to mind with fimi? Yes?
I happen to know another meaning of the word, because in the church sensation, fimi is the little poem that accompanies each bishop. Each bishop has a fimi, as we say, which is the little song that when he enters a church you sing,
yes,
which describes which area he is bishop for, and what areas he is pastorally responsible for. That's called fimi. I don't know why it's called fimi,
right.
but it's called fimi. I don't know
so at the base of that,
it describes what he's responsible for. Yeah, it introduces him to the church congregation. That's what it is.
But it could be, what is he known for?
Yeah, what's he known
right.
for? Yeah.
So it is what he is reputed for. Okay, so one other aspect of fimi is reputation, and if I could translate that in English, I'm not sure that I would translate it as fame. I might equally translate it as reputation. And what do you understand about reputation? What is reputation? Is it reality? Is it truth? Is it beyond reality? Is it better than reality? Is it distortion of reality? It could be any of these. Halfway? Okay. So it could be many different things. It could be reputation that is justified. It could be reputation that is unjustified. It could be reputation that extends reality, complements reality, but also distorts reality. It affects single humans, it affects groups, it affects departments, universities, societies, countries. There's stereotypes in the modern world, you know, reputation of someone really being very smart or being wise, or these people, they work very hard, or you know, Greece has gone through an economic crisis, but it has also gone through a reputation crisis. I'm not sure whether you witnessed that, but there's lots of people who are misinformed about what Greeks do, and even though we have such brilliant minds, very often you hear Greeks don't work, or they're lazy, they do whatever. So reputation can have many dimensions of extending, complementing, and distorting reality. Any other thoughts about phimi? How about hysterophymia?
I wanted to say that.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, I wanted to say that.
Yeah, so how does hysterophymia build into this?
Phimi reminds me, hysterophymia, it was the first thing I thought.
Yeah,
when I read.
yeah. So, especially in Greek civilization, there was always, from ancient Greece, there was that drive that you should live a life that when you pass away, your name survives, and it survives in a positive way, that you have done something great. You fought in the war, or you created some nice sculpture, or you did whatever you did. So hysterophymia is also very important. And some of that is intangible. If you're dead, you may have very different perceptions about what that means. Some of us may believe that, we live in afterlife. Others may just feel that, no, it's all done. But regardless, lots of people worry about their hysterophymia, about their reputation. So phimi is all of that, in a way. Why sixth fame? Okay, so how many senses do we have? 5, okay? So if you want to extend, complement, or distort reality, which is captured by the senses, science is guided by the senses. We can extend them with electronic microscopes or with telescopes, but it's still these senses that we use. The extension, the complement, and the distortion of reality is fame, and it's the sixth sense in a way. So the book starts with 3 mottos along these lines, and the first motto is from Plato, from Phaedon. Philosophia est η μελέτη θανάτου. Philosophy is the study of death. So a direct attack on or challenge to the famous Tractatus, that there is some weird guy who's trying to challenge on philosophy grounds the greatest philosopher of the last century. Shame on him. But then, to make things worse, the second part, the second motto is γίνονται τελετές με όλα τα ασφαλιστικά ταμεία. We can perform funeral services with all types of insurance coverage. And this is an inscription in a funerary service office that I came across. Γραφείο τελετών οδός Γεωργίου Μπαλή. So this is a society where death is very prevalent, and we will take you dead no matter what. Just die and we'll take care of it. And the third is from Shakespeare, the tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice, where Cassio says, reputation, reputation, reputation. Oh, I have lost my reputation. I have lost the immortal part of myself, and what remains is bestial. My reputation, Iago, my reputation. So really concerned about that hysterophymia, that reputation. What would people say about him? And Iago replies, as I am an honest man, I thought you had received some bodily wound. There's more sense in that than in reputation. Reputation is an idle and most false imposition, oft got without merit and lost without deserving. You have lost no reputation at all, unless you repute yourself such a loser. So Iago is among the early paradigms of people who can handle reputation very well. They can twist reputation whichever way they want. They can make it fine with themselves, with their conscience. Maybe they have no conscience. They can live with any sort of manipulated reputation and say, come on, that's nothing. Don't worry about it. There's more serious things like money, power, and reputation. This is just hearsay and thin air. So, as Nikita said, the book has 240 chapters, and 166 of them, which is the majority, are called paralogies or paralogues. What do people make of paralogie? What does this ring a bell in any way? Yeah.
A paralogy, which is also irrational in some sense.
So paralogy, which is variation, is actually the main structural unit of my previous book. The title was Variations on the Art of the Fugue, Paralogies πάνω στη τέχνη της φυγής, and The Desperate Ricercar, και ένα με Ricercar. So these are not paralogies, which are variations. They're paralogies, which has some resonance with paralogies. So you expect perhaps to see a variation on a theme, but also paralogy, I mean, basically Nikita said, is something that is absurd. It's something that is irrational. Now, in Greek literature, in medieval Greek literature, there's a special type of text that is called paralogies. I'm not sure whether some of you may remember from high school the song of the Iofiri της Άρτας, the Bridge of Arta, or the song of the dead brother, του νεκρού αδελφού. What is typical of these paralogues, or these paralogies, is that they're narratives, so they're describing a story, they're narrating a story, which could have been real, but there's some elements that are interspersed within that real narrative that are completely absurd. And, based on what we know, they could not have happened. It's a little bit close to Borges and magical realism, but it's a recipe on its own, because in many of these paralogues you would say, well, this can happen just like that, but now, oops, that's not possible. So, for example, in the paralogue of the dead brother, it's a reasonable story. A lady has 7 sons and 1 daughter, and the daughter gets an offer to get married far away in Persia, and the mother says, she's my only daughter, the only person who can help me if I grow old, if I need help, and I can't leave her go away. And one of the 7 sons, Kostadis, says, oh, come on, Mom, let her go. If anything goes wrong, I will go and get her back for you. And then, the next scene, we see a young man knocking at the door at that daughter who has married far away in Persia, or, who knows, at the other end of the world, and saying, your mother needs you desperately, and you need to come with me. And then we see them riding in the middle of the night on horseback, transversing the entire universe or known world at the time, and getting back to the mother's house, who has lost all her sons, and she opens the door and she recognizes the daughter, and they realize that the person who brought her back was that son who has died. And obviously, he couldn't have done that very easily, but that little detail distorts the entire reality, which could have happened as part of a novel. People travel, they go far, they marry far away, and but that was a dead person riding through the night all over the world, getting the daughter back to her mom. So this is an example of a paralogy, of a paralogue, and these texts are mostly narratives, but with this introduction of elements of irrationality and absurdity. How do you feel about irrationality? Do you feel that our world is rational? Is your experience rational? Your daily experience, your let's say your consciousness, history, the way that people understand themselves as citizens of the world, as part of some heritage, and especially for Greeks, given the experience that Greece has gone through, at least to me, I have felt a lot of irrationality all the time. That, you know, there's things around me that are completely irrational, and there's no way to justify them on everyday life. It's not like I need to see Harry Potter with some witch trick or whatever. Reality per se is irrational. You don't need Harry Potter. You just need reality, and it's far more irrational than any Harry Potter. So how do you deal with that? How do you describe that? How do you treat that? How do you manage that? How do you overcome that? How do you exploit that? I think is a main challenge. Then there's the constructions, and there's 21 constructions, and the constructions are probably the most scientific component of the book. So typically they have data, and they're real data. They're not irrational data or fake data or just thingy or you know, fame or reputation. They are real data. Sometimes they're information, scientific information. One of the constructions includes a very extensive list of all the most highly cited Greek scientists of Greek origin around the world. So 714 scientists, and anyone who sees these pages, they run like this. It doesn't look like a novel or like a poem or anything. It has data with 6 citation indices and with websites and where these people are, so you can track what they do and where they came from and so forth, and what disciplines they work and where they've been. So it's a complete statistical analysis of starting from 20 million scientists that are the entire scientific community around the world who publish papers, selecting those with Greek names, who represent about 3% of the global scientific community for highly cited scientists, even though the population of Greeks is about 0.1% in the world. So it's about 30 times more in terms of density. But 97% of them have done their main work not in Greece. And 87% of them are not in Greece nowadays. Otherwise, I would not have such a great audience today. So this is very typical for Greece, because the Greek civilization started existing when the Greeks split apart. If you think about it, you know, in archaic times, it was the colonization and the spreading of Greeks all over the Mediterranean world that created that impetus of thinking, free thinking, new ideas, philosophy, natural science, and all the other things, the democracy that, you know, Greek civilization is famous for. It never really depended on huge centralized states that were stable. It was individuals and small city-states and people traveling all over the world. And that prototype is not just Greek. I would say it's part of the modern experience. It's clearly the experience of scientists who very often migrate, and you have to migrate both in thinking and sometimes also physically in order to get things done. And it transcends the human experience across races and nationalities. I mean, people travel in physical terms and in their minds. And many of the constructions are dealing with that travel and what it means traveling, what it means leaving, but also the sentiments of leaving. My previous book, if you think about the Art of the Fugue, Die Technik des Fliegens. Art of the Fugue is a famous work by Johann Sebastian Bach, but it's also the art of running away, or the art of departing, or going away, or leaving, which then, there's that second component, which is returning. Ricercar is the same root as ricerca, research, but also returning, coming back, and finding yourself, perhaps. So constructions, there's lots of data there. Most of those real data. There's also some simulation. So one construction, for example, is simulating a university. I'm using some number seeds to generate the characteristics of all the faculty of a university. And then randomly I picked for you the characteristics of your mentor, of your dean, of your professor, of your advisor. And your dean may have psychopathology, your advisor may be heavily committed to religious excess, your professor may be greedy and just trying to get the most out of you. So it's all probabilistic. If you happen to hit upon these people, there's a chance that you may hit a combination of 5 vices as part of the faculty profile. Then there's the obituaries of scientists. How many of you read obituaries? You read obituaries, okay. Okay, I think that that's very interesting. I think I have avoided reading obituaries systematically, like, I don't know, you don't want to hear about death. I mean, you want to hear about nice things and life and enjoying yourself.
That's what they talk about in the obituary.
Yeah, well...
what they try to talk about anyway.
But then you get a sense that many times they're kind of exaggerated or kind of extreme, and they always try to say good things about who has passed away. And among these 714 highly cited scientists, 32 have passed away. And I tried to find their obituaries and piece together information about their lives as scientists, as thinkers, as people with different experiences, whatever I thought was most interesting to know about. So I got to learn a lot about people who had some unusual experiences sometimes, trying to survive, trying to thrive, sometimes even trying to make sure that they will remain alive, for example, during World War II or the Amphibious, the Civil War, or being chased by right-wing people and by communists and by both, sometimes trying to escape in the middle of chaos and establish a living somewhere. I found these lives very interesting, and I thought that it would be interesting to have this dimension of their fame, of their reputation, of their example of a reputation as scientists and what they went through, to be part of the book appearing in irregular intervals. Like, here's another story. Like, as you hear about the stories of different people, or as you hear about the parables in the New Testament, these are like stories of sense of science, in a sense. Maybe I'm taking the example too far, but you can learn probably from people who have suffered, and it makes your own experiences and your own rejections and your own failures possible to see in a different light. You say, wow, look at that. I mean, that guy went through all of that. I should be very, very happy that I'm still alive, and I was just rejected 1,000 times. He was rejected 2,000 times. So I think it's useful to have this perspective from people who come from very, very different disciplines and very different types of experience. The last type of text, there's 21 rapes of Persephone. So, apαγωγές της Persephones, and how many people remember the myth of the abduction of Persephone? Okay, so Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the earth and of life, because earth gives life by producing everything that we eat and we can sustain ourselves. And she was abducted, she was raped practically by the god of the underworld, by death. Very suddenly, while she was playing with her friends, he arose from the darkness of the underworld and grabbed her away. But then something went wrong. Clearly Demeter complained and she wanted her back, and she said, that's it, I'm not going to give any more life to planet Earth unless I have my daughter back, and Zeus has to do something about it because everybody will starve. But the world of the god of the underworld had a different plan, and he offered to Persephone pomegranate and therefore she had to continue spending some time with him. And the compromise was 6 months underground and 6 months with spring and summer with the rebirth of the world. So this is a story of the interface between life and death, which is probably the most acute interface of reputation, fame, where everything is being tested out. And if it fails that test, that's like the ultimate test. It's also a story of love. It's actually a story of very violent love. So these pieces, I would say, are the closest to what one would call poetry, even love poetry, but violent love poetry at the interface of love and death. And each of the Persephones has a geographical prescription. Most of the geographical prescriptions have the names of universities. So there's an abduction of Persephone of Harvard, there's an abduction of Persephone of Stanford, there's an abduction of Persephone of Cornell, there's an abduction of Persephone of Columbia, there's an abduction of Persephone of Cambridge. I don't think I have an abduction of Persephone of Oxford. Sorry. Almost all of them have some link to some university. With rare exceptions, there is a central Persephone, which is Persephone Thalassa. What does Thalassa mean to you? I'm asking an audience of mostly Greeks. So, along with Maria Elena, we went to the beach right before that, which was where the Oxford punting base was, and she described it as the Paralia. So the beach. But what does Thalassa mean to you? I mean, the one thing in Greek civilization in terms of scenery is Thalassa. Even when I was a professor in Ioannina, in the morning, at noon, and in the afternoon, I was thinking of Thalassa. Thalassa is 40 miles in that direction. And, I need to find some time to go to Thalassa. A little bit like these 10,000 soldiers left in the middle of Asia Minor, deserted of all hope and everyone trying to make their way to Thalassa, and when reaching at the top of the mountain after many, many months, screaming Thalassa, Thalassa, that at last we see the sea. Sea, is it sea? Sea. Thalassa is Thalassa. It's not sea. It's not ocean. It's Thalassa. I mean, if you can't find a word, then you know that this is very different from anything that you can see in the UK, in the US, in California. That seemingly has Mediterranean climate. When I went to Stanford, when I landed, I told Despina, let's stop at the Thalassa. So we went to Half Moon Bay by the Pacific Ocean, and I opened the door and I was taken away. That was not Thalassa. So Persephone Thalassa is the central Persephone, and if you read that piece, it's a bit of a complaint of a lover of South Thalassa who has been betrayed. And maybe that lover is death. Maybe also the poet and the writer is death. Maybe he's killing things that he touches. But that death complains to Thalassa about being too far away and not really being worthy of continuing. So these are the four types of text. They have some connectivity between them, so they can be read in isolation. One of my friends, who's a great writer, George Aristinos, he was talking to other people, and he said, well, if you want to read Tractatus Iatinecti Fimi, you need to read it slowly because you can get a lethal dose. So you can read it piecemeal, or you can try the lethal dose, to read it from scratch from the beginning to the end. There's, I don't know, I think that Nikitas carried 20 books for people who want to try the lethal dose and run the risk, but you know, I hold no responsibility for this. And what I'm going to do is read you some pieces from the Tractatus. I think I can read them in Greek. We have satisfied the English language requirements, I believe. But we also have English translations because we have some people who would not obviously understand the Greek. There's also remote control, is that right?
Yeah, of course.
We're in the community department.
Ah, yes. So it must be.
Is there remote control?
Back here and
Before you start reading,
yes, yes.
As a psychiatrist, can I ask something?
Oh, good. Please don't lock me out.
I can't stop sort of recognizing in all the bits you mentioned the relational element, which is something about relating the facts themselves, but also the way we perceive the facts, either post-death or while people are alive. And knowing what your scientific interests have been is something about the way we perceive the facts and the way we attribute reality to the facts, and how sometimes the facts survive, whether they're perceived in the right way or not. So there is something about understanding the facts right, or something about how you make sure that actually you approach the facts in the right way.
Right.
You did sort of hint a little bit about the post-truth and post-truth reality and all that.
Yes.
I don't know whether there's one thing I wanted to ask you now that I got you here. It's about very often I wonder about very famous people who have survived over the centuries, and sometimes I compare them with saints. Now, saints is some people who, for some specific cultures, are considered very important, without necessarily having done something that. I'm not talking about perhaps saints who wrote very important things. Yeah, Maximus is considered important because of what he wrote. But about saints that were very important for the people who lived with them. Let's say St. George, for example, who is the patron saint of this country, for example. St. George. I mean, English people never met St. George. Yeah, okay, he lived in what is now Asia Minor. Why is St. George so important for a country like England, for example? And I wonder whether anything in your book, for example, approaches that issue of people who made a very strong, with their presence, create a very strong influence to people around them. But then somehow they survived for what now, 18 centuries now? St. George is important for this country. Do you approach this issue at all? I mean, without the religious sort of.
Absolutely, yeah. And we can take the religious part away, yeah. But exactly.
What survives?
This is one of the main things that are being sought in the book. What survives, what parts of truth or fame or non-truth survive, and why, and how much of the most meritorious or the most truly important work and people don't survive sometimes. So a main theme throughout the book is about very meritorious people and very meritorious work that has disappeared. And we know that, and we have that very well documented, in the arts, in sculpture, in painting, in in science. Hopefully, we haven't seen this type of ellipsing of knowledge, but science is under continuous threat. We have gone through the Middle Ages where science did ellipse for a long while, and we are now living in a world that has a lot of anti-science forces trying to destroy science.
We have theories that were very prominent at that time, and then now they're completely dead.
Right, and maybe justifiably dead. So there's always that pondering of whether extinction or survival is justified or not, and to what extent that should be so. So I will read you a few of these ruminations in the Paralogies. So the first paralogy I'm going to read. Oh, okay, I managed to shut it off somehow.
There might be a button on the controller.
Probably. I must have pressed something wrong. So if we can get it to work, the first paralogy 3, επικράτηση των ανύπαρκτων διαφημιστών έντων, or the non-existent advertisers prevail from within. So advertising is one type of fame, very prominent so in our world, and some of the experience being described for people like you who are international and travel, probably you have been in the airports very often in your life. So it's building on such a seemingly real experience, but there's some irrational that is happening in that. Let's see.
It's a live proof that the world is not rational.
Yes. So I mean, computer science department. I think the most failed talk I've ever given was at the computer science department of MIT. It took them 1 hour to be able to launch the slides, and after they did that, all the slides were distorted, and not only mine, but also the subsequent. None of the presentations were even remotely close to what was supposed to be. Excuse me. I'm short. I'm giving a talk right now. I'll call you later. Bye-bye. I hope that was a good explanation.
It was a truth.
And it was not fame. It was 100% truth. So, παραλογή 3, επικράτηση των ανύπαρκτων διαφημιστών έντων. Έσαιρνε ανέμελο στη βαλίτσα του διαστάσεων λίγο μικρότερων από το απόλυτο μεταφυσικό όριο των 56 επί 35 επί 23 εκατοστών σε κάποιο αεροδρόμιο. Nothing unusual. Ήταν σε έναν μεγάλο διάδρομο που οδηγούσε από την πύλη Β17 στην πύλη 18 όταν συνέβη αυτό το δύστηνο συμβάν που περίμενε αργά ή γρήγορα να συμβεί. Ήταν καλά προετοιμασμένος για το ενδεχόμενο. Οπότε έτρεξε να βρει αμέσως καταφύγιο σε κάποιο δωμάτιο που να κλείνει μια κάποια πόρτα πίσω του. We'll need a second explanation. Κλείστηκε όσο μπορούσε καλύτερα ερμητικά, επισφάλισε την ασφάλεια της πόρτας και μέτρησε μέχρι το 712. Όσο είχε υπολογίσει πως θα χρειαζόταν για να περάσουν οι διαφημίσεις, τουλάχιστον οι πιο επιτακτικές και επικίνδυνες. Έπειτα άνοιξε δειλά την πόρτα και τόλμησε να δει τι συνέβη. Υπήρχε άραγε τρόπος ακόμα να περιμαζέψει τον χρόνο από το σύμπαν, σαν άτακτο χαμίνι. Είχαν όλα ακυρωθεί. Μια βρύση ήταν εμφανώς ανοιχτή, αλλά δεν έτρεχε νερό. Το σαπούνι είχε ήδη εξαντληθεί πριν καν το χρησιμοποιήσει. Η πρώτη σκέψη του ήταν να ρωτήσει αν αντιστέκεται ακόμα η βασιλεύουσα,
αν εποάζονται οι βοκαμβίλιες, αν γλιστρούν τα ελάφια στο καναβάτσο, αν πεταρίζουν τα νύχια, αν ψήθηκαν καλά στους 450 βαθμούς Κελσίου τα τριαντάφυλλα, αν υποφέρουν οι μαρτυρικές κνήπες στα ρολόγια του Λίχτενστάιν, αν εξελίσσονται δαρβινικά τα κάδρα, αν έχει η σκόνη συλλεκτική αξία, αν αποδράσανε οι βαρυπινίτες κακοποιοί μαζί ή χωρίς τα βιογραφικά του σημειώματα. Αυτή η ενιαία ή έστω ενοποιημένη σκέψη πέρασε από το νου του σαν κοπάδι από αντιλόπες που τις κυνηγούν ίενες. Δεν υπήρχε ψυχή όμως σε όλο το αεροδρόμιο. Είχε μετρήσει σωστά. Ίσως δεν χρειαζόταν μάλιστα μέχρι το 712, ίσως μέχρι το 527, να είχε το ίδιο σιγουρευμένο αποτέλεσμα. Ήθελε να πει κάτι από όλα αυτά, αλλά τα λόγια του ήταν κατά λέξη τα λόγια των διαφημίσεων που είχε ακούσει. Όσο και αν έψαξε, δεν είχε άλλο λεξιλόγιο, δεν γνώριζε άλλο θέμα, δεν κάτεχε άλλη γλώσσα. Άρχισε να μιλά, άρχισε να διαφημίζει τα λόγια των ανύπαρκτων πλέον διαφημιστών, αλλά δεν υπήρχε κανείς πλέον να τον ακούσει, ούτε καν εκείνος ο ίδιος. So this is a paralogue about fame and advertising, and how advertising is internalized and occupies the writer, the speaker, the hero of the story, and he becomes synonymous with the thinking of the advertising, more or less. Paralogue 7 Παραλογή 7. Οι ικά καθήκοντα που προκύπτουν από την ενταφίαση. Ήταν παρόν στην ταφή, αλλά από τότε δεν ξαναεπισκέφτηκε το συγκεκριμένο νεκροταφείο. Οι λόγοι ήταν πολλοί. Βουλγάρες υπηρέτριες ανάβανε τσιγάρα και τα αφήνανε όρθια πάνω στα πρόσωπα των πεθαμένων Ελλήνων κυρίων τους να καπνίζουν, ώσπου να καούν, ή ώσπου να προλάβουν να απαγγείλουν τον τελευταίο στίχο από το Ηρώ και Λέανδρος. Αλλήλων δαπώναντο και εν ποιμάτο περολέθρο. Ό,τι προλάβαινε να πυροβολήσει τον αντίπαλο λαϊκό θυμόσοφο νωρίτερα, όπως σε μονομαχία καουμπόιδων με περίστροφα Colt σε western του 50. Έπειτα, Αθηναίοι δημοκράτες της κλασικής περίοδου, circa 338 π.Χ., στείνανε ορθούς λέοντες πάνω από τα σήματα των πεσμένων οπλιτών των τσάρων Ασπαρούχ, Κρούμ και Σαμουήλ. Αυτά τα δύο, από μόνα τους, θα ήταν σοβαροί λόγοι. Αλλά ήταν κι άλλοι λόγοι, πιο δύσκολο να ερμηνευτούν. Ήταν που καθώς γύριζε η περιστρεφόμενη θύρα, ο Ελικόνας είχε βρεθεί από την άλλη πλευρά της αίθουσας αναμονής του μευτηρίου. Ήταν οι λευκά ανθισμένες αμυγδαλιές που κατακτούσαν το τοπίο στη μνήμη του, σαν απικία ανθεκτικών βακτηριδίων ξανθομονάδας. Ήταν το αυτοκίνητο Σκόντα που δεν μπορούσε να αναρριχηθεί σαν επιβίτορ αγριομέλισσα πάνω στα ντούρα αγριολούλουδα. Ήταν το σημειωτόν βήμα της θάλασσας πάνω στους χάρτες της ανθρωπογεωγραφίας, τόσο που όταν σκεφτόταν την Ελλάδα, εκείνους τους τρεις νομούς είχε αποφασίσει να τους αφήσει στην άκρη για ώρα ανάγκης, αν τυχόν και έπεφτε λοιμός και μεγάλη πείνα. Η ιστορία είναι σαν ένα χωράφι που πρέπει να το αφήσεις μερικές χρονιές χωρίς να καλλιεργήσεις τίποτα. Υπήρχαν και άλλοι λόγοι, ή αντίλογοι βέβαια, όπως εκείνοι οι ασήμαντοι λόφοι στην Ξεραΐλα, που τους υποπτευότανε ανέκαθεν ότι του κρύβανε κάτι σημαντικό. Για παράδειγμα, Βοξίτη, η μπόλικη μικηναϊκή ιστορία, με περιδέρεα όμορφων γυναικών και δόντια αγριοχείρων. Ή πάλι οι λίμνες, όπου είχαν διαπραχθεί σχολικές εκδρομές και στιγνά εγκλήματα σύμφωνα με τα φωτορεπορτάζ, χωρίς να ξέρει τι από τα δύο ήταν το πλέον αποτρόπαιο. Εκείνες τις αφαιρούσε πάντα από το τοπίο, όπως ανοίγει σχιστές θέσεις για τα μάτια σε μια χάρτινη μάσκα του βενετσιάνικου καρναβαλιού. Μόνο 5 χρόνια αργότερα, όταν βρέθηκε σε άλλη χώρα, σε άλλη ήπειρο, σε ένα καλόγουστο κεντράκι αναψυχής, σε μια εντελώς άσημη κομμόπολη, με κατακεφαλή ακαθάριστο εισόδημα στο 5ο εκατοστημόρι της χώρας, ρώτησε τον σερβιτόρο αν η άγνωστη του πολιτεία διαθέτει νεκροταφείο. Φυσικά και διέθετε. Βεβαιώθηκε επίσης ότι είναι το μοναδικό στην ευρύτερη περιοχή. Φυσικά και ήταν το μοναδικό. Πήρε ταξί και ρώτησε τον ταξιτζή αν μπορεί να βρεθεί εκεί σε 5 λεπτά. Φυσικά και βρέθηκε εκεί σε 5 λεπτά. Έβαλε το χρονόμετρο στο ρολόι του και επί 2 ώρες ακριβώς έψαχνε να βρει τον συγκεκριμένο τάφο του αδικοχαμένου πατέρα του. Φυσικά και δεν τον βρήκε. Κι όμως, όταν πάτησε το υπερσύγχρονο χρονόμετρο και είδε πως έγραφε 2 ώρες, 0 λεπτά, 0 δευτερόλεπτα και 79 εκατοστά, ένιωσε ικανοποιημένος που είχε επιτελέσει το καθήκον του για μια πενταετία. Παραλογή 12. Διέγερση προσδοκιών από την άφιξη της νεαρής ντεμπιτάντ. Θα επαναστατούσε. Ήδη τοποθετούσε τη νεαρή ντεμπιτάντ του Μπελκάντο στο κέντρο του άδειου καθιστικού στην επιβλητική έπαυλη. Τα ολίγιστα έπιπλα είχαν υποχωρήσει στις γωνιές των δωματίων, σαν διαμαρτυρία που κόπασε ή εξέγερση που φθήνει. Θα μπορούσε εκείνη να γεμίσει το ανεκπλήρωτο κενό. Υπολόγιζε πως η γούνα της μόνο, όταν θα την είχε αποποιηθεί σε μια θεατρική αποστροφή, θα εξημέρωνε σε μεγάλη απόσταση όλη την αίθουσα υποδοχής και θα εκπολίτιζε το 1/3 του εξαίσιου λιακωτού. Έτσι και έγινε. Αλλά μετά διέθετε και άλλα του. Απ' τα ανοιχτά παράθυρα, 4 εκτάρια δάσους κρυφοκοιτάγανε τα δρόμενα στο εσωτερικό του σπιτιού. Εκείνη δεν είχε τρακ μπροστά στο πολύβουο κοινό που έλειπε. Όμως είχε υπερεκτιμήσει την ικανότητα των εραλδικών βημάτων της, τον σκοτεινό αιματισμό της, τη φωτεινή φωνή της, το εκτόπισμα του συνοδού κλιβοκύμβαλου, τον τρόπο που ψηλαφούσε τις φλωρεάλ τοιχογραφίες στον τοίχο, όπως ψηλαφάς ένα διαραγέν ανέβρισμα της αορτής και δεν μπορείς να ειδοποιήσεις τον ναρκωμένο ασθενή ότι τελικά δεν θα τα καταφέρεις να τον σώσεις. Την παρατηρούσε χωρίς να έχει σκοπό να την ευνηδιάσει, να την προσταφαιρέσει από την πραγματικότητα, να την μειώσει, ενώ να την εξυψώσει καρφωμένη σε ένα κοντάρι σαν σημαία του Θιβέτ, ή πόσο μάλλον να την εκμεταλλευτεί. Απλά του θύμισε ξανά πόσο ελάχιστο όγκο καταλαμβάνουν οι άνθρωποι, ούτε 1% μέσα στα σπίτια και στα όνειρα. Παραλογή 13. Ελεγεία και παβάνα για μυρμηγκοφάγο. Ο μυρμηγκοφάγος είχε ένα λερό ροζ τρίχωμα. Ήταν και ενεπίγραφος. Δεν μπορούσα να διαβάσω τα κείμενα. Ίσως αρχαία επιγράμματα του Σιμονίδη. Ή μάλλον, ίσως ήταν θούριος του Τυρταίου. Ίσως Αλκμάν. Εκείνη, χωρίς να εμφανίζεται, επέμενε να τον αγοράσω. Εγώ διαφωνούσα. Έχει διχαλωτή γλώσσα, διαμαρτυρήθηκα. Θα σου φάνηκε. Δεν μπορεί, απάντησε εκείνη, πάντα χωρίς να εμφανίζεται. Μπορεί να με δαγκώσει, ισχυρίστηκα. Δεν έχει συμβεί ποτέ δείγμα μυρμηγκοφάγου, απάντησε εκείνη, καλά πληροφορημένη από τα εγχειρίδια και συνεχίζοντας να είναι απούσα. Όλη αυτή την ώρα μόνο τα χέρια της φαίνονταν καθαρά, δελεαστικά και προκλητικά παρήσακτα μέσα στην οθόνη στο οπτικό μου πεδίο. Αυτά τα σχεδόν αποκομμένα χέρια της τακτοποιούσαν το προσπόληση ζωντανό σε καλύτερες θέσεις. Δεν είδα ποτέ το κεφάλι της να με επιβουλεύεται, δεν είδα τα πόδια της ή το σώμα της, ακόμα και όταν εμφανώς πρέπει να έχει εξαπλώσει για να αναπαυθεί ο μυρμηγκοφάγος επάνω της, σαν υγρός άπωσης. Δυσκολευόμουν να αποφασίσω. Δεν μπορούσα να εξηγήσω γιατί δεν μεταφέρει περισσότερα kilobytes από τον Αλεξανδρινό νεοπλατωνισμό στο κορμί της. Στο τέλος, κατάλαβα την απάτη της προτινόμενης αγοραπολισίας. Στο διπλανό δωμάτιο ήταν ένα μεγάλο αχρησιμοποιητό γραφείο. Τα πόδια του ακουμπούσαν επάνω σε κατεργασμένα δέρματα λεοπαρδάλεων. Είχαν αφήσει ανοιχτά τα παράθυρα για να δούνε πόση βροχή μπορεί να μπει μέσα σε διάστημα 40 μηνών. Εκτός από τις λεοντές και το εγχειρίδιο της βιασμένης Λουκριτίας που ήταν αφημένο πάνω στο γραφείο, υπήρχαν εκεί κεντρικές μονάδες επεξεργασίας παλιών υπολογιστών. Ο κάθε ένας διέθετε αποθηκευμένες πληροφορίες που αντιστοιχούσαν σε 4 χρόνια της ζωής μου. Τις είχαν αφήσει εκεί, να αιωρούνται από το ταβάνι, σαν χειρομέρια που θα έφτιαχναν κάποτε εξαιρετικά ώριμο ισπανικό ζαμπόν στο Βιέδο ή στη Θέλτα. Παραλογή 17, πάνω στο θέμα της εξαφάνισης των καλύτερων έργων ή των πιο διάσημων, on the theme of the disappearance of the very best, ιστορία του μεγαλύτερου ζωγράφου όλων των εποχών. Απόσπασμα του Bernard Bernson, The Decline of Art, The Italian Painters of the Renaissance. Michelangelo lived long enough to be distinguished with difficulty from Marcello Venusti, and perhaps a premature death alone saved Raphael from sinking to a less brutal Giulio Romano. Ο Σάντο Αλντομπραντίνι υπήρξε χωρίς την παραμικρή αμφιβολία ο μεγαλύτερος ζωγράφος όλων των εποχών και οι νοπογραφίες του στο παρεκκλήσιο Φρεσκομπάλντι και στην αψίδα του ιερού της Σάντα Αελάια in Navis συνιστούν κατά τεκμήριο το σημαντικότερο έργο του. Γεννήθηκε όταν έπρεπε και έζησε όσο χρειαζόταν, καθόλου παραπάνω. Τόσο εκείνος, όσο και το έργο του έχουν εξαφανιστεί ολοσχερός. Δεν υπήρχε δόλος, απλώς ζωή. Μετά την εξαφάνιση δεν έχει απομείνει καμιά σημαντική ουλή στην ιστορία. Τα μόνα σημάδια που σήμερα που γράφω παραπέμπουν με αδιαμφισβήτητη βεβαιότητα στην αλλοτινή ύπαρξη του Σάντρο Αλντομπραντίνι και της Σάντα Αελάια in Navis είναι τα ακόλουθα. Πρώτον, στον νηπτήρα της Φερνάντα Κωνστάντζα, σε ένα προάστιο του Σάο Πάολο, υπάρχει μια ξανθή τρίχα 4,5 εκατοστών που έχει κατεύθυνση νότιο-ανατολική προς βόρειο-δυτική. Ενώ αν ο Αλντομπραντίνι και το έργο του δεν είχαν υπάρξει, το μήκος της τρίχας θα ήταν 7 εκατοστά και η κατεύθυνσή της νότια προς βόρεια, 38 μοίρες διαφορά. Δεύτερον, σε συντεταγμένες 09-44 βόρεια, 118-44 ανατολικά, στο νησί Πάλαβαν των Φιλιππινών, έξω από το Πουέρτο Πρινσέθα, υπάρχει σήμερα ένας βόλος κοκκινόχωμα 0,19 γραμμαρίων, που δεν μπορεί η παρουσία του να εξηγηθεί χωρίς την παραδοχή της ύπαρξης του Αλντομπραντίνι και του αριστουργήματός του. Περίπου όπως από τις διαστρεβλώσεις των βαρυτικών φάκων συνεπάγεται η ύπαρξη εξωπλανητών που διέρχονται ελεύθεροι τον διαστρικό χώρο. Τρίτο, το 8ο μανταρίνι που έριξα βιαστικά στη σακούλα αγοράζοντας φρούτα στο Whole Food Market σήμερα είχε 2 φιλαράκια αντί για 3, που θα ήταν το αναμενόμενο αν η Σάντα Αελάια in Navis δεν είχε ποτέ ζωγραφηθεί και ανιστορηθεί με τον μοναδικό αυτόν εικονογραφικό κύκλο που έχει χρησιμοποιηθεί έκτοτε σε πάμπολα εξαφανισμένα έργα απειράριθμων εξαφανισμένων ζωγράφων και κατά συνέπεια δεν έχει επιβιώσει και μας είναι παντελώς άγνωστος. Αυτή ήταν για μένα και η πιο ατράνταχτη απόδειξη. Και αυτός ήταν και ο λόγος που αποφάσισα να ασχοληθώ με τον Σάντρο και το αξεπέραστο κορυφαίο του δημιούργημα. Τον είδα σε ένα διάλειμμα του έργου του, όταν παρατηρούσε ακόμα τους 7 βοηθούς του που ήταν ανεβασμένοι στις καλοσιές. Τους βοηθούς τους υπολογίζω σε 7. Για την ακρίβεια, η μέθοδος που χρησιμοποιώ και που στηρίζεται στην έπτυξη μιας σειράς Taylor τους υπολογίζει σε 6,76. Οπότε στρογγυλεύοντας 0,76 βοηθούς σε έναν ολόκληρο, προκύπτουν 7 βοηθοί ως ο επικρατέστερος αριθμός. Ο 7ος μάλιστα, αυτός που υπήρχε μόνο κατά 76%, ήταν σαφώς ο καλύτερος από όλους. Και σε αυτόν παρέδωσε τελικά την μποτέγκα ο δάσκαλος σε προχωρημένη ηλικία. Μαζί του παραχώρησε και ένα τομίδιο, όπου στη σελίδα 198, μια τρίχα 4,5 εκατοστά, έδειχνε πού ξεκινάει η παράγραφος που περιέγραφε το μεγαλύτερο μυστικό των εικαστικών τεχνών. Ούτε το τομίδιο, ούτε και το μυστικό έφτασαν ως εμάς. Άλλη μια χτυπητή συνεπικουρούσα απόδειξη για τη μεγαλοφία του Σάντρο. Στο διάλειμμα λοιπόν, οι 7 βοηθοί ζωγραφίζανε όλοι τους πυρετοδός πάνω στη συνόπιε που είχε σκιαγραφίσει ο Σάντρο, το χιτώνα του διάκονου Στεφάνου, την κοιλιά του μεθυσμένου Νόε, το πελιδνό σώμα του μαχαιρωμένου Άβελ, τον τροχό της Αγίας Εκατερίνης μαζί με τους εκτελεστές της, αλλά χωρίς εκείνη. Αυτό συνέβαινε γιατί οι μελετητές είχαν εξακριβώσει ύστερα από αρκετούς αιώνες ότι η Αγία Εκατερίνη δεν είχε υπάρξει ποτέ, εκείνη της Αλεξάνδρειας τουλάχιστον, σε αντίθεση με την Αγία Εκατερίνη της Σιένα, που τη σωματική της υπόσταση δεν αμφισβήτησε κανείς και ποτέ. Σε σημείο που μετά θάνατον οι φανατικοί θαυμαστές και λάτρες της κόψανε το κεφάλι με αλυσοπρίωνο και το δάχτυλο με ψαλίδι για να τα λατρεύουν ξεχωριστά. Αλλά ας επιστρέψω στον ήρωά μου μετά από αυτή την αχρίαστη παρέκβαση. Το έργο του Αλντομπραντίνη στη Σάντα Ελάια η Νάβης ήταν τεράστιο. Έπασχε από έναν γιγαντισμό αριστείας που έκανε τους συναδέλφους του να συρρυκνώνονται από το φθόνο και να μεγαλύνονται από τη μοχθηρία. Κι όμως δεν θα μπορούσε να τα κάνει όλα μόνος του, όπως πριν από 20 χρόνια που είχε πρωτοξεκινήσει το εργαστήρι του. Τότε είχε άλλα όνειρα, άλλες προσδοκίες, άλλες δυνάμεις. Τώρα ήταν υποχρεωμένος να εστιάσει στα σημαντικότερα. Μόλις είχε τελειώσει το λεπτεπίλεπτο χέρι της Σάντα Μαρμοράτα. Το επόμενο που θα έκανε ήταν το κεφάλι και τα μισά μαλλιά της βασίλισσας του Σαββά. Αργότερα αυτά. Για την ώρα κοιτούσε το έργο του να εξελίσσεται, ενώ έτρωγε ένα μανταρίνι μαζί με ένα σβόλο κοκκινόχωμα 0,19 γραμμαρίων. So there's lots of irrational elements, obviously, in this text, but many of those that sound to be the most irrational, actually they're real. So, you know, Saint Catherine of Siena and Saint Catherine of Alexandria, what is being described is entirely true. You know, Saint Catherine of Alexandria never existed, but a whole legend has been built around her, and lots of stories and tributes to her, and some of the greatest art of the Renaissance has been her life. Saint Catherine of Siena indeed had this fanatical fans and lovers who cut off her head with a chainsaw and snatch her finger with scissors to worship them separately. That's real history about one of the most famous saints of the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. So does Sandro Aldobrandini exist? You can find out if he was really real.
Of course he does. You just proved it. You just proved it. Of course he does.
Yes, I mean all the evidence points out to the existence of the most famous painter of all times, because he has distorted reality with his passage, with all these evidence. Paralogue 44, Memoirs of the Punctual Professor. του ομιλητή που ήταν πάντα στην ώρα του. Η διάλεξη ήταν προγραμματισμένη για τις 8 το πρωί. Εμφανίστηκε στις 7:47. Του άρεσε να έχει άνετο περιθώριο τουλάχιστον 10 λεπτά για να οργανώσει τη σκέψη του. Το κοινό είχε αρχίσει νοχελικά να συγκεντρώνεται. Έγραψε στον πίνακα κάποιες ακαταλαβίστικες σημειώσεις που θα του ήταν ενδεχομένως χρήσιμες στην παρουσίαση εκεί που θα χρειάζονταν τα λογικά άλματα και υπερβάσεις. Η ώρα πήγε 7:56. Το κοινό είχε συγκεντρωθεί, υπήρχαν πολύ λίγες θέσεις, κάποιοι φέρανε πτυσσόμενα καθίσματα από τις γειτονικές αίθουσες. Τους κοίταξε, μάλλον ανέκφραστα. Αργότερα, εκ των υστέρων και εκ του ασφαλούς, κάποιοι χρησιμοποίησανε την έκφραση περίλυπος, άλλοι επιμένανε εκστατικός και άλλοι είπαν τίποτα ασυνήθιστο. Έκανε μια κίνηση με το δεξί του χέρι, σαν να ήθελε να πει μια στιγμή παρακαλώ ή ίσως ή σίγουρα, και βγήκε από την αίθουσα χωρίς να μιλήσει. 7:57. Ο διάδρομος ήταν σκοτεινός, περπάτησε μέχρι το μαρμάρινο κλιμακοστάσιο. Κατέβηκε τον πρώτο όροφο με τα μαυρόασπρα πλακάκια και τους παραγγελμένους επιπληρωμή πίνακες των πεθαμένων κοσμητόρων και ευεργετών. Ήταν ήδη 8:02. Δεν ήθελε να αργήσει στην ομιλία του. Βγήκε από το νεοκλασικό κτίριο με τα αγάλματα του φαύνου και του ερμήψυχου πομπού στην είσοδο. Άρχισε να περπατάει στον δρόμο, κάποια στιγμή πέρασε απέναντι. Ήταν 8:17. Σκόπευε να αρχίσει να μιλάει αυστηρά στην ώρα του. Ήταν μια μορφή αυτοσεβασμού η αιμονή του να μην είναι ποτέ αργοπορημένος. Μπήκε στο πρώτο σπίτι που συνάντησε, συνδυασμός απικιακού στυλ με Bauhaus, είχε πολλά δωμάτια, τα διάβηκε όλα. Δεν ήταν αυτό που ήθελε, δυσανασχετούσε. Είχε ήδη πάει 8:31. Πάντα άρχιζε τις ομιλίες του με απόλυτη συνέπεια στην προσχεδιασμένη ώρα. 8 ακριβώς. Βγήκε από το σπίτι, μπήκε στο διπλανό, συνδυασμός γκρόπιους και ιαπωνέζικου μινιμαλισμού, ακόμα περισσότερα δωμάτια, αν είναι δυνατόν, ήταν και σε πολλά επίπεδα. Τίποτα. Δεν το βρήκε αυτό που έψαχνε. Θυμήθηκε με κάποια ανακούφιση πως δεν έψαχνε τίποτα εξάλλου. Το ρολόι του έλεγε 8:46. Η παρουσίασή του ήταν προγραμματισμένη για 8:09. Ωριαία διάλεξη, μετά τις 8:45 σκόπευε να άφηνε χρόνο για 2-3 σύντομες ερωτήσεις από το ακροατήριο. Δεν είχε αργήσει ποτέ, άρα ήταν εξασφαλισμένο πως δεν θα αργούσε ούτε και σήμερα. Αυτή η ρεαλιστική βεβαιότητα, γνωστή και εγγυημένη όσο η τετριμένη επανάληψη ότι ο ήλιος ανατέλει εξ Ανατολών κάθε μέρα, τον γαλήνευε. Πετάχτηκε στο δρόμο. Είδε το λεωφορείο Γ 560 να πλησιάζει. Θα τον βοηθούσε να φτάσει έγκυρα. Ανέβηκε. Άδειο από επιβάτες. Ήταν τώρα 8:58. Υπήρχε ακόμα χρόνος να ξεκινήσει την ομιλία στην ώρα του. Δεν είχε αργήσει καθόλου. Το λεωφορείο προσπέρασε την αίθουσα διαλέξεων, προχώρησε. Κακός υπολογισμός, σκέφτηκε. Δεν υπάρχει στάση εδώ κοντά, αλλά δεν αναστατώθηκε. Όλα ήταν υπό έλεγχο. Τώρα εμφανίστηκε και το διαχωριστικό κυκλίδωμα που χώριζε τις δύο πλευρές του δρόμου. Δεν θα υπήρχε τρόπος πλέον να περάσει απέναντι στην πλευρά της λεωφόρου που ήταν το αμφιθέατρο. Δάκρυσε. Η ώρα είχε φτάσει 9:19. Θα έφτανε αναμφίβολα στην ώρα του. Όπως πάντα. Όλοι αυτοί οι συγκεντρωμένοι ακροατές θα περιμένανε υπομονετικά να τον ακούσουν. Κανείς δεν θα είχε κουνηθεί από τη θέση του. Κατέβηκε από το λεωφορείο με την πρώτη ευκαιρία. Περίμενε το επόμενο. Η ίδια γραμμή Γ 560, το ίδιο άδειο. Ανέβηκε στο όχημα στις 9:32 πρώτα λεπτά. Με κατεύθυνση αντίθετη από τον προορισμό του, απομακρυνόταν. Δεν υπήρχε καμία αμφιβολία μέσα του πως θα έφτανε στην ομιλία του πριν από τις 8. θα περιμένανε όλοι ακόμα. Σαφέστατα είχαν καταλάβει τη δεδηλωμένη, σχεδόν συνθηματική κίνηση που τους είχε κάνει με το δεξί του χέρι. Δεν θα μπορούσε να ερμηνευτεί με κανέναν άλλο τρόπο, παρά μόνο ως μια στιγμή παρακαλώ ή ίσως ή σίγουρα. Ήταν σαφέστατη η πρόθεσή του. Όσο για τις σημειώσεις στον πίνακα, συμμεριζόταν πως θα ήταν εντελώς ακατανόητες αν δεν ήταν εκεί να τις εξηγήσει. Γι' αυτό φυσικά θα έφτανε στην ώρα του στις 8, ούτε δευτερόλεπτο καθυστέρηση, θα τα ξεκαθάριζε και θα φώτιζε όλα όσα ήταν συγκεχημένα στο χιλιομπερδεμένο μυαλό τους. Ήταν 10 και 22 πρώτα λεπτά. Δάκρυσε. Απομακρυνόταν. Και μία κατασκευή αποσπασματική όμως, γιατί η ώρα έχει περάσει. Εμφανώς. Η κατασκευή λοιπόν είναι μία διάλεξη που έδωσα στη μνήμη του Δημήτρη Τριχόπουλου. Ήταν καθηγητής μου στο Πανεπιστήμιο Αθηνών και θα σας διαβάσω κάποια αποσπάσματα. Ο Δημήτρης Τριχόπουλος αναδείχθηκε με το έργο του ως ένας από τους σημαντικότερους επιστήμονες της Ιφιλίου τον τελευταίο μισό αιώνα. Προσωπικά είχα το προνόμιο να τον έχω καθηγητή από πρωτοετής φοιτητής. Κοιτώντας την βάση PubMed, σήμερα βλέπω πως ο δάσκαλός μου δημοσίευσε 906 δημοσίευσεις μέχρι το θάνατό του και μετά το θάνατό του έχει δημοσιεύσει άλλες 23.
I don't think what you're reading is on there.
It's a little different. Yes. Sorry for that. I tried to convey it in a bit different language, but it's almost the same. Yeah. Δεν συγγράψαμε ποτέ κάτι μαζί, αλλά αποτελούσε για μένα ένα διαρκές σημείο αναφοράς, ένα φωτεινό σημείο αναφοράς. Συναντιόμασταν συχνά, αλλά ήταν σαν να συναντιόμασταν σπάνια, αλλά ήταν σαν να συναντιόμαστε συχνά πυκνά. Οι περισσότερες από τις συναντήσεις μας τα τελευταία χρόνια γίνονταν την πρωτοχρονιά στο αεροδρόμιο ή στο αεροπλάνο, καθώς και οι δυο διαλέγαμε αυτή την μάλλον ασυνήθιστη ημερομηνία για να ταξιδεύουμε από την Αθήνα για το Harvard. Ο Τριχόπουλος ήταν ένας αικίνητος ταξιδευτής του νου προπαντός. Μόνο αν βρισκόσουν σε κίνηση, κυριολεκτικά και μεταφορικά είχες ελπίδα να τον συναντήσεις. Η φράση «τα χρωστάω όλα στον δάσκαλό μου» έχει χρησιμοποιηθεί τόσο πολύ που πλέον ακούγεται τετριμένη. Στην περίπτωσή μου όμως είναι πραγματικότητα, κυριολεξία. Αν δεν υπήρχε ο Τριχόπουλος, δεν θα υπήρχε καμιά πιθανότητα ούτε 1% να εκλεγώ και να υποβιβάσω με την ανάξια παρουσία μου για τόσα χρόνια το Ελληνικό Πανεπιστήμιο. Κατά την εκλογή μου στο Πανεπιστήμιο Ιωαννίνων, από τους 3 εισηγητές, μόνο ο Δημήτρης Τριχόπουλος είχε γράψει θετική εισήγηση. Ο πρώτος εισηγητής έγραψε μόνο μια παράγραφο που ξεκινούσε με την πρόταση «Ο ομογενής Ιωάννης Ιωαννίδης, ορμόμενος εκ Νέας Υόρκης, στερείται ηθικού, νομικού και συνταγματικού ερίσματος στην υποψηφιότητά του». Δεν σας διαβάζω το υπόλοιπο κείμενο που ήταν πολύ χειρότερο. Ο δεύτερος εισηγητής επίσης έγραψε μόνο μια σύντομη παράγραφο που έκρινε πως το έργο μου είναι εξαιρετικά περιορισμένο και δεν διαθέτει εύρος για να καλύψει έστω στοιχειωδώς το γνωστικό αντικείμενο. 5 χρόνια αργότερα, στην προαγωγή μου, στην βαθμίδα του καθηγητή και πάλι με εισήγηση του Δημήτρη Τριχόπουλου, η ανεπάρκειά μου είχε γίνει ακόμα πιο έκδηλη. Σε σημείο που η γραμματέας γυμνασιακής μορφώσεως που έλαβε το φάκελο της εκλογής μου στο Υπουργείο Παιδείας και Θρησκευμάτων τον επέστρεψε πίσω στο Πανεπιστήμιο δηλώνοντας ότι είναι εμφανές πως ο κύριος Ιωάννης Ιωαννίδης δεν διαθέτει ούτε καν τα ελάχιστα απαιτούμενα προσόντα για καθηγητής. Όντως, λοιπόν, τα χρωστάω όλα στον δάσκαλό μου. Το πρώτο μέρος της ομιλίας στηρίζεται σε αριθμούς, ενώ το δεύτερο είναι μια μεταανάλυση χωρίς αριθμούς. Όμως ας εξηγήσω τι εννοώ. Στο πρώτο μέρος θα σας παραθέσω στατιστικά στοιχεία πάνω στους 672 επιστήμονες με ελληνικά ονόματα που έχουν τη μεγαλύτερη επιρροή στην επιστημονική βιβλιογραφία. Από αυτούς οι 33 έχουν πεθάνει και οι 639 είναι ζωντανοί. Το δεύτερο μέρος είναι ένα μετακείμενο που συνθέτει στοιχεία για τη ζωή, το έργο και τις δυσκολίες που αντιμετωπίσαν οι 32 που πεθάνανε πριν από τον Δημήτρη Τριχόπουλο. Ο σκοπός μου είναι να εξετάσουμε αν μπορούμε να εκμεταλλευτούμε ως χώρα και ως κοινωνία τους άλλους 639 που είναι ακόμα ζωντανοί, αλλά και να εξασφαλίσουμε ότι ο ελληνισμός θα αναδείξει και πολλές χιλιάδες άλλους κορυφαίους επιστήμονες στο μέλλον. Στον ευρύτερο επιστημονικό χώρο υπάρχουν πάνω από 20 εκατομμύρια συγγραφείς που έχουν δημοσιεύσει τουλάχιστον μία δημοσίευση καταχωρισμένη σε μεγάλες βιβλιογραφικές βάσεις. Τα ελληνικά ονόματα αντιπροσωπεύουν περίπου το 1% του συνόλου, δηλαδή 200.000, αν και πληθυσμιακά οι Έλληνες αποτελούν λιγότερο από το 0,2% του παγκόσμιου πληθυσμού. Στους κορυφαίους επιστήμονες το ποσοστό ελληνικών ονομάτων πλησιάζει το 3%. Προχωρώ πιο κάτω, περνάω αρκετά κομμάτια. Έρχομαι στο δεύτερο μέρος της ομιλίας, προσπαθώντας να ανιχνεύσω τα ίχνη των διακεκριμένων Ελλήνων επιστημόνων που φύγανε από τη ζωή πριν από τον Δημήτρη Τριχόπουλο. Από τους 32, 28 πεθάνανε μακριά από την Ελλάδα, ένας πέθανε εξόριστος στην Ελλάδα, ένας πέθανε στην Ελλάδα από ατύχημα, μια πέθανε στην Ελλάδα από καρκίνο λίγο μετά την επιστροφή της από το εξωτερικό και ένας πέθανε στην Ελλάδα σε περίοδο διακοπών. Ο αρχαιότερος επιστήμονας από τους 32 είναι φυσικά ο Αριστοτέλης. Αν και τόσο παλαιός, συνεχίζει να αναφέρεται στη σύγχρονη επιστημονική βιβλιογραφία συχνά. Η γενέτειρα του Αριστοτέλη, τα Στάγυρα, καταστράφηκε στη Θέμελα από τους Μακεδόνες το 348 π.Χ. Ο Φίλιππος που την κατέστρεψε την ξανάκτησε αρκετά χρόνια αργότερα, ίσως έπειτα από παράκληση του φιλοσόφου που είχε στο μεταξύ αναλάβει παιδαγωγός του γιου του Αλεξάνδρου. Πάντως ο Αριστοτέλης δεν ξανάρισε εκεί. Ο φιλόσοφος ξόδευε 2 περιόδους από τη ζωή του στην Αθήνα, 20 χρόνια τη μια και 12 χρόνια την άλλη. Την πρώτη φορά έφυγε διωγμένος κάτω από άγνωστες συνθήκες όταν ήταν να διαδεχτεί τον Πλάτωνα. Η διαδοχή δεν τελεσφόρησε γιατί προτιμήθηκε ως Πεύσιππος, που ήταν μεν σαφώς υποδέστερος σε προσόντα, αλλά ήταν ανιψιός του Πλάτωνα. Ο Αριστοτέλης αναζήτησε τότε καταφύγιο στην Άσο και στη Λέσβο και μετά στην αυλή του Φιλίππου, εκείνο ακριβώς που είχε καταστρέψει την πατρίδα του. Η δεύτερη φορά που χρειάστηκε να φύγει από την Αθήνα, ο Αριστοτέλης έπεσε πάνω στο αντιμακεδονικό αλαλούμ που προέκυψε μετά το θάνατο του Αλέξανδρου. Όπως και σήμερα σε πολιτικά ασταθείς στιγμές, κανείς δεν συμφωνούσε με κανέναν και όλοι κατηγορούσαν όλους. Έτσι, αν και ήταν μάλλον επί πολλά χρόνια αντίπαλος του παραστρατημένου μαθητή του που είχε μεταμορφωθεί σε απολυταρχικό Πέρση ηγεμόνα και Αιγυπτιακό θεό, κατηγορήθηκε επίτηδες από κάποιον αντιμακεδόνα ιερέα, Ιεροφάντη, για ασέβεια στα θεία, όπως μας λέει ο Διογέννης Λαέρτιος, και αυτοεξορίστηκε άρον-άρον για να μην τον σκοτώσουν και γίνει ο δηλητηριασμένος από τους Αθηναίους Σοκράτης νούμερο 2. Πέθανε τελικά μάλλον από τη μελαγχολία του, εξόριστος στην πολύ μακρινή Χαλκίδα. Δεν είναι εξακριβωμένο αν δηλητηριάστηκε από μόνος του ή τον δηλητηρίασαν μεταφορικά ή κυριολεκτικά. Αθήνα-Χαλκίδα, κάπου 70 χιλιόμετρα, για εκείνη την εποχή είναι πάνω κάτω χρονικά αντίστοιχη απόσταση με Αθήνα-Παρίσι σήμερα. Χαλκίδα-Στάγυρα, μιλάμε για πάνω από 500 χιλιόμετρα, τεράστια απόσταση. Μάλλον δεν θα πρέπει να τον προσμετρήσω ότι πέθανε στην πατρίδα του. Όταν ήμουν φοιτητής στην Αθήνα, με εγωίτευε η απορία που μπορεί να είναι το Λύκειο του Αριστοτέλους, όπου δίδασκε περπατώντας. Μάλλον είχα συμβουλευτεί κάποιον χάρτη που με επιφύλαξη το τοποθετούσε κάπου στη γωνία του Εθνικού Κήπου, πίσω από το Κοινοβούλιο. Το Κοινοβούλιο είναι τα παλαιά ανάκτορα του Βαβαρού βασιλέα της Ελλάδας Ότο, που έκτισε ο Βαβαρός αρχιτέκτονας της Βασιλικής Αυλής της Βαβαρίας Φρίντριχ φον Κέρνερ. Η Αθήνα είναι φορτωμένη βαβαρικά χρέη. Το 1996 ανακαλύφθηκε ότι το Λύκειο ήταν λίγα μέτρα πιο πέρα στην οδό Ριγίλης και τώρα πλέον είναι ένας ωραιότατος αρχαιολογικός χώρος προσβάσιμος στο κοινό. Αλλά το 1984, ως πρωτοετής φοιτητής, συνήθιζα να περνάω συχνά από το μυστηριακό σημείο που μπορεί και να ήταν το Λύκειο. Το κεντρικό του σημείο το είχα τοποθετήσει φαντασιακά σε μια πολύ απόμερη γωνιά του Εθνικού Κήπου. Δεν υπήρχε κάποια έξοδος από αυτή την πλευρά και δεν περνούσε σχεδόν κανείς από εκεί. Μου άρεσε αυτή η απροσδιόριστη ρομαντική ερημιά. Μέχρι που ένα μεσημέρι πήγε να μου ρηχτεί ένας κίνοδος ντυμένος ιερέας. Με πλησίασε, κάθισε στο παγκάκι και άρχισε να μου κάνει διάφορες πρόστιχες σεξουαλικές ερωτήσεις ανάμεικτες με θρησκευτικές αναφορές. Θυμάμαι μόνο πως ήταν χοντρός και φορούσε αυτά τα βαριά σκουρόχρωμα ορθόδοξα άμφια κατά μεσήμερο. Το έβαλα στα πόδια και γλίτωσα τρέχοντας όσο μπορούσα μακρύτερα. Δεν χρειάστηκε να φτάσω στη Χαλκίδα πάντως για να αποφύγω τον επιθετικό ιεροφάντη. Δεν με ακολούθησε για πολύ, έτσι υπέρβαρος που ήταν. Δεν θεώρησα σκόπιμο να ξαναεπισκεφτώ το μυστηριακό Λύκειο από τότε. Από τους άλλους 31 διαπρεπείς νεκρούς Έλληνες επιστήμονες βρήκαν νεκρολογίες ή κάτι αντίστοιχο για τους 30. Ένας από αυτούς πέθανε στην Ελλάδα από ατύχημα. Ο Ιωάννης Βαρδουλάκης, κορυφαίος επιστήμονας στον χώρο της γεωμηχανικής, έπεσε την ώρα που έκοβε κάποιο δέντρο έξω από το σπίτι του στην Αθήνα. Άλλη μια, η Μαρία Πέτρου, κορυφαία επιστήμονα στην επεξεργασία σήματος και στη ρομποτική, πέθανε από καρκίνο μέσα σε 3 χρόνια από την επιστροφή της από την Αγγλία στη Θεσσαλονίκη. Οι άλλοι 28 δεν πέθαναν στον ελλαδικό χώρο, όσο προσωπάροχα και αν ορίσουμε τον ελλαδικό χώρο από γεωγραφική άποψη. So, I think I will stop here because it's already very, very late. And I don't know if there's any burning questions or thoughts or...
Who's the narrative? Who's the narrator?
Okay, well, what do you think?
I don't know the chapters of it. Someone, in my opinion, especially for some of the paralogies, first of all, I've never read your book yet. Just in some of the paralogies, it sounds that the narrator himself was in a state of mind that was not able to appreciate reality and was willingly or unwillingly allowing himself to be either distracted or influenced by little irrational facts. So in a way, especially I was specifically impressed by not the painter, the next one you described them.
The professor.
Yeah, the professor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, clearly not in a sound state of mind. Sound like a lot of the patients I see.
Yeah.
But it feels very realistic for him, though. It feels very realistic for him, so it's nice. It's a nice insight into his mind. So I was wondering whether you're trying to imitate like the other ones. So that state of mind where actually facts don't count so much. So there's a lot of room for irrationalities that.
Right, right. But this is not the professor speaking. I mean, it's someone who's narrating the fate of that professor who maybe is having a view of reality that is not the reality that others have. Or maybe something has happened to him. You know, maybe he has died, for example, and he hasn't even realized, and he's still thinking that he needs to give his lecture at 8 o'clock. And at 8:45 he would be getting questions, and you know it's 9, 10, 10:30, and time goes away, but he's still trying to get back, but he cannot.
I thought maybe he was in the room and he fainted.
Okay.
And that's what came to my mind, that he had this surreal feeling that he was going out of the room while everything was happening around him.
So you can find many ways that you can try to justify that as part of reality. You know, that could be some sort of a dream or reality while someone has fainted or some thinking or someone who has taken drugs or someone who's dead and you know this is an effort to have his afterlife or you know last minute experience while dying. So you know, there's many ways that you can see that, but there's also some other elements like, you know, his inability to communicate and his effort to communicate by making these notes, and by feeling that now that he's gone, these notes would not be possible to be understood, and also his gesture that has these different interpretations, and unless he's there to defend what he means, others will understand it very, very differently. So the writer has that dilemma. He writes something, he has something in mind. The readers may understand something different because each one of us has very different backgrounds and beliefs and expectations and connecting points. But these are still valid interpretations. Maybe they're not my interpretation necessarily, but if they're yours and if you feel something about it, this is still fine. It doesn't have to be identical. There's a passage in Plato about books that an Egyptian god or demon said that you know books. What an invention! It's a horrible invention. People who read books, they believe that they understand what they mean, and that's a huge misunderstanding.
books are notes at best. And unless you have lived that, unless you have that truth and wisdom in yourself, just reading it in the book means absolutely nothing. You become the kisophos, the person who thinks that he or she is wise, but actually is not wise, and has read all the books, can write down all the equations, can take excellent grade in all the courses, but really hasn't gone through that, hasn't discovered this, hasn't gone through the process of how do you arrive at this, and has just, especially in Greece and the Papagalia system, I mean, you know exactly what I mean. You don't need to think of Plato and very old stuff.
Funny enough, actually, you said that Aristoteles was being mocked in the school because he was the first one who was reading. Because all the other people, obviously, they didn't read. They had the slaves who were reading for them.
Right.
They would just sit. That was. They would just sit around. They would just listen. That's how they accessed the texts. And Aristoteles, I read, was the first one who actually read from morning till he was a nerd, essentially. And they were mocking of him. Yeah, his nickname was the reader, actually.
Yeah. So within the book, there's real people, historical people like Aristotle and his life, and lots of real people and their life experiences, especially scientists, many of them, but also writers and philosophers and what they have gone through. There's people who are not real, but they're simulated, and there's even mathematical simulations sometimes, constructing personalities based on simulations. That's a nice way to simulate characters. And there's people who have some, let's say, likelihood of existence, like the seventh assistant of Sandro Aldobrandini, who exists only by 0.76 because the expansion of the Taylor series gets 6.76 assistants. So, he exists by 76%, but he may be the most important. In other paralogs, there's people who are claimed to be the most famous mathematician, the most famous X and Y and Z, and we know nothing about them. And the truth is that, given human history, most likely the greatest mathematical mind, the greatest mind in physics, the greatest mind in chemistry, the greatest person in writing ability, and the greatest minds died before they could materialize themselves. Even nowadays, if you think of 7 billion people, how many have the opportunity to materialize themselves? The greatest mathematician may have been born in some village in Africa or in China and never had the opportunity to do what they were supposed to do. The chance of having materialized is extremely low. So some of the paralogs say that none of the great potential of humanity has materialized. It has all evaporated. We have some pieces, and even those that did materialize mostly have been destroyed. So there's other paralogs that talk about Sandro Aldobrandini, I can tell you, does not exist, or it's a simulated personality. But there's others like Parrhasius and Zeuxis, who are the greatest painters of Greek antiquity, along with Apelles, and again, nothing of their work survives. Probably they were the greatest painters of all time, but nothing, absolutely nothing survives. The Pompeii frescoes are like third rate, at least based on what people who had seen their work can tell us, and they look so fabulous. They were nothing compared to their work, and everything has disappeared. So one paralog is trying to reconstruct, these lost people and what is real. The very best has disappeared, and now we have something that looks like reality, but is it reality? How much does it count if the very best has disappeared? So coming back to who is the narrator, there's several narrators within the book. There's polyphony, as I said up front. There's some pieces that look like theatrical dialogues, that people talk with each other, and there's dialogues, and there's even some action that happens pretty quickly. There's some dialogues that happen in Paris, in the gardens of Luxembourg, and others that happen in promotion committees in universities, and others that happen at the deanery, and you hear different viewpoints about the same thing surrounding issues of fame. So, you know, in universities we try to measure fame all the time, and I think we mismeasure it largely to a good extent. Any? Yeah.
What is the significance of the cover of the book? I want to tell you that I have an interest in hard landscape.
Yes, yes.
I'm trying to guess where it is from. Is it Philopappou? Is it Pompeii? Is it Ioannina?
So actually,
is it somewhere?
Yeah, it is from Erice in Sicily. And also the Prometopida is also from Erice, which is very dark. But if you look carefully, this is a tower. It's a medieval tower. And in my books, I tend to choose very often photos that I take from places that are not necessarily from Greece per se. They're from the greater Mediterranean world. Or there's a combination of different places. So the variations, for example, have some pieces from Antipaxi and other pieces from the Villa Farnesina in Rome, and other pieces from New York, actually from Chicago, skyscraper. So they have some sort of international feeling. But yeah, this is where they are from. And there's a couple of stories that are set in Sicily. One of them actually in Erice, and the other one is in Segesta, where there's an ancient temple, Greek civilization, but not built by Greeks, by different people who adopted Greek culture in Sicily. Any other questions? Or yes?
How easy it is or difficult is to write a paralogue in modern times?
I don't know. I can't measure that. I think that my schedule is so crazy that I have adapted evolutionarily to write in any place. So I can write at an airport while being squeezed in an airplane, in a break during a meeting, or sometimes having more time and quiet to think. But clearly I don't write necessarily having like total silence around me. These stories, these ideas, these words may torture me for a while, and I may carry them for days or weeks, but then I can write something very quickly, within minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes. I will revisit that 20 times perhaps. And sometimes the first version looks like the best I could do, but very often I would change that extensively. And also there's another layer where at the end of the day you try to put together all of these stories and you try to maximize their connectivity. So there's some references of one paralogue to another, or one construction to several paralogues. And there you need to build a network, much as you build a system of equations, and you want to make them consistent as much as possible. I think there's lots of mathematics in writing, actually. I see it this way. People say that you need to write emotionally. Yes, of course, but emotion alone can take you only that far. You need to think in terms of structure, of maximizing connectivity in the single text and across the text. Yeah?
I was going to ask, you know, it's about the way you're writing. I wonder which helped what. The scientific writing helps the more artistic writing, or the other way around? Because the way you describe writing about the parallels is sometimes how some of us write papers for journals.
So
or the other way around.
I see that as complementary to pure scientific writing. First of all, there's many parts in the Tractatus and in other books that are, in the logic sense, scientific writing. There's scientific data in there and scientific interpretations. But obviously, scientific writing has some format. And especially in medicine, the format usually is very boring. It's introduction, methods, results, discussion. So IMRAD is like 95% of the papers.
and I feel very much constrained. Actually, if there's some people to blame about that imposition of structure, I'm probably one of the people to blame the most, because I've written so many reporting guidelines that you need to report this and this and this and that, and don't deviate from this, because then you'll get a bad grade, and you'll get your paper come back to you for revisions. So I feel very much constrained in that, and some of the papers that I have enjoyed the most, like the Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, deviate completely from that pattern. It has more of a literary structure of theorem and proof, or mathematic exposition and corollaries, much like the Tractatus. And I feel that literary writing allows you to try different things. It doesn't mean that you can try anything. You can try anything and fail miserably. It doesn't mean that if you deviate, you will do well. You're at your own risk. You're free to embarrass yourself. Just go ahead and become ridiculous. That's so easy. But I like the fact of trying different techniques. There's many techniques that are already known. Some of the constructions use cloud construction. Other are optical poems. Some are compilations of inscriptions. So there's one. Others are taken from books of the early 18th century, being compiled, like the Cours de Peinture par Principes in Paris, 1708. So there's some others have figures to describe with geometrical terms what's going on and where the heroes are during what's happening. This is Remnants of Civilization. It's piecing together all the inscriptions from Byzantine churches from the area of Tarantas in southern Italy, and some of the texts are in Greek, others are in Latin, and some are in both Greek and Latin. There's inscriptions that use both, and some of them are distorted on their own, and this is what has remained of all of that civilization. And along with these pieces, these fragments of the civilization, there's my own writing that is interspersed with with all of it. So it's a salad of civilization, in the sense of what is surviving or not surviving. So there's different techniques, and I'm very eager to try different ways to express oneself. Yeah.
When you start writing this book, and can I ask a second question? But when it comes to your books, I'm not talking about your papers. When it comes to your books, do you write in paper, or do you type in your laptop?
So this book took about 4 years, and I write in paper almost always, with the exception of the technical pieces. The most technical pieces, I write in paper the outline, so the architecture of what I want to do. And then, for example, if you have this piece, you need to take material, like you take stones from a demolished church to build a new one. So you need to take these pieces and put them together, and you can do that online. Or if you want to generate a statistical cloud, or there's another one that, or these obviously you cannot write in paper, or these you cannot write in paper because it's a tag cloud software composition that this is my entire previous book in a condensed form that you can read it in one page. And there's another such construction that takes some of the major classics like the Chartres de Parme of Stendhal and Hölderlin, and again, so this is Hamlet, and this is The Wasteland, and by T.S. Eliot, and this is Patmos, Diotima, Hyperion's Schicksal, Lied of Hölderlin, and 4 pieces for the Chartres de Parme of Stendhal, 4 of my favorite writings.
If you want to read them within 2 pages, this is their tag cloud deconstruction. So these are constructions, but also deconstructions, because our civilization is mostly deconstructing currently, I think. It's not constructing, but it's simplifying. I only have 2 minutes. Can I please read a story by Stendhal in 2 minutes? Here you go. This is it. Go ahead.
Do you write in Greek or in English?
Mostly in Greek. It's interesting. Scientifically, I write in English. Literature, I write in Greek. Sometimes there's some middle ground, and I have to say that in the book that I'm working on over the last 3 years, which is called Meta ta Physica, or Meta Physics, I write in parallel in Greek and in English. It's always a big challenge because Greek is spoken and read by very few people. At the same time, you need to write in whatever language you feel better qualified and you feel more at home. I don't think my English is bad. I think it's probably pretty good. But I think naturally it's easier for me to write this type of text in Greek. But there are exceptions. There are times that I feel more natural to write in English. So there's some texts that have that interface between different languages.
Have you played any games in the book? Have you encrypted deeply any message, any obituaries, anything that you would never like to reveal to us, but we might get a book and discover?
Yes. So it's like a treasure hunt. I'm really evil. This is what I mean by that late stage construction and cross-linking of the book. There are lots of hidden layers and hidden messages that my principle is that some writers say, well, the book needs to be easy to read. People don't have time if they start and read the first couple of sentences and they're saying, wow, what's going on here? This guy must be drunk. I mean, let's do something easier and have some fun, and it's summertime, let's go to the beach and read something and pass the day. This is one option. Try to get the reader think as little as possible, nothing secret, nothing hidden, absolutely nothing, everything easy flowing. I loved her, she loved me, we loved each other, and that was great. At the other extreme, I think I'm at the other pole of that paradigm, where I would feel bad if someone reads the book the first time, says, okay, I think there's a couple of points that I liked, and others that looks weird, who knows. Then at some point says, I'd like to go back and take another look. I would like to make sure that second time they will find some more things. And if they go again for a third time or fourth time, I would really feel ashamed if they try again and they say, well, now there's nothing. I have found everything. So it's a little bit like a room that has secret doors that you press here, and there's an opening that you can go into another room. And then the other time you enter, you realize, let me take a look at this, and you press the button, and there's something new happening that you hadn't noticed. So the book is full of traps for the reader to get lost. But hopefully get lost in I'm not sure I would say in an enjoyable way, but at least an interesting way. There's some fun, there's some thrilling fun at times. But there are many such traps throughout the book, and some of those I think are more difficult to decipher than others.
Can I ask a quick one? I mean, you mentioned Bach's Art of Fugue, which is, as probably some people know, a very mathematical sort of work, still very artistic. Is there any other sort of great work that sort of runs through this as a structure that you had in mind when you were writing this?
Any other like
Music works.
oh music works?
That is, in a way, it structures the run through your book, so as a key understanding.
So the Tractatus, I think, is less dependent on music compared to my previous books. The variations where, clearly both the Art of the Fugue and the Rittercar from the musical offering of Johann Sebastian Bach, the Art of the Fugue being the last and the musical offering being the one prior to last, that major work, or the previous to that, the Toccata for the Girl with Burnt Face. It's a toccata, which again is a musical term and musical composition. The Tractatus, I think, among art references, uses more visual arts compared to music, which is more prominent in the variations and in the toccata. And I think, if anything, the toccata and the variations are closer to poetry. I think this is closer to prose, and that distinction comes forward also because of the referencing of visual arts versus musical arts. But there are also many references to musical pieces throughout the Tractatus as well. It's just that it's not occupying the main leitmotifs as in the other books. Okay.
So we could go on all night.
Yes.